The wind carried dust that night, red, restless, and full of secrets. Out by the edge of Hollow Bend, the saloon lamps flickered like tired eyes, and somewhere down the dirt road, a carriage came to a stop. She stepped down slowly. A thin veil hid her face, trembling in the cold Wyoming air. No one spoke. Only the door hinges groaned, and a lonely dog barked once, then quieted as if even he felt the weight of her silence. Her name was Evelyn Moore. A mail-order bride from Virginia, carrying a letter of promise in her pocket, and a fear she couldn't wash away. When she looked up, she met the eyes of Jonas Walker, a cowboy worn by sun and sorrow, holding a bouquet of wild daisies. The dust swirled between them like a curtain drawn by fate. He didn't flinch, she whispered, almost too soft for the wind to carry. "I'm not pretty," and the man just nodded, his voice low and steady. "That's fine. I need honest, not fancy." That's where this story begins, between two strangers, and a quiet kind of courage. And if old tales from the West still stir something in your chest, stay a while, subscribe, and listen with us as we ride back into the dust and memory of Hollow Bend. The wind that afternoon carried red dust from miles away, soft at first, then sharper, cutting through the stillness like memory through quiet. Hollow Bend sat under a pale sun, its wooden storefronts leaning with age, its windows dulled by sand and time. A stray horse clopped past the blacksmith shop, its shadow long and wavering across the dirt. Somewhere, a church bell rang once not for prayer, just because the wind pushed it. A carriage rolled in from the east. The wheels creaked over the hard ground, scattering dust that shimmered gold in the light. When it stopped in front of the livery, no one hurried to greet it. Folks here didn't rush for strangers anymore. From inside stepped a woman in a gray dress, her face hidden beneath a thin lace veil. She paused, steadying herself with one gloved hand on the doorframe. Her boots sank slightly into the dust. She looked up, not at the town, but at the empty horizon beyond it, as if making sure the world hadn't ended. Across the street, a man watched. He stood beside a hitching post, a bouquet of wild daisies clutched awkwardly in one hand. His hat was pulled low, the brim shadowing eyes that had seen too much sun. Jonas Walker, 36, a rancher by trade, a man who spoke little because silence had always done the job. He didn't move until she turned toward him. Then, as if remembering his purpose, he took a slow step forward. The daisies trembled in his grip. "Miss Moore," he said, voice roughened by dust and distance. She nodded once. No words came from her. The veil fluttered with her breath. Behind them, the driver shifted impatiently, the leather harness creaking. A tumbleweed scraped across the street like something lost and restless. Jonas cleared his throat, the sound startling even him. "Long ride from Virginia." She gave a faint smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Longer than I thought." Her voice was soft, as if she hadn't used it much lately. He nodded toward the wagon waiting down the road. "Place ain't far, just a few miles west, past the creek." When she didn't move, he hesitated, then offered his hand. Not a gallant gesture, more a quiet truce between two people who didn't know what else to do. She looked at it for a heartbeat, then placed her gloved fingers in his. His palm was rough, warm. Hers trembled once before steadying. They walked toward the wagon, the sound of their boots hers light. His heavy made a rhythm that matched the creak of the wooden boards beneath their steps. Around them, Hollow Bend watched in silence. A curtain moved here, a whisper there. People always had time to talk when nothing else was happening. As Jonas helped her onto the seat, the wind shifted, the veil brushed against his sleeve. Through that thin fabric, he caught a glimpse not of her face, but of the way she turned slightly away, guarding something fragile. He looked down, pretending not to notice. "Weather's turning," he muttered. "Ought to get you home before the chill sets in." She nodded. Her fingers gripped the edge of the seat. For a long while, neither spoke. The wagon wheels rolled steady over the dry earth, the horse's breath forming small clouds that vanished in the light. From behind the veil, Evelyn Moore watched the land unfold wide, endless, quiet in a way that made her chest ache. Back home, the air had smelled of rain and salt water. Here, it smelled of smoke, iron, and something she couldn't name, maybe loneliness. Jonas stole glances when he thought she wouldn't notice. There was a stiffness to her posture, a carefulness like someone afraid of breaking the world around her. He wondered what kind of pain made a person hold themselves that tightly. But he didn't ask. Men like him rarely did. When they reached the edge of town, he slowed the horse and looked sideways. "Not much out there," he said, "just land and wind." She turned her head toward the horizon. "That's enough." Her answer surprised him, not by the words, but by the steadiness in them. Something about her made him realize this wasn't a woman looking for rescue. She was here to outlast something. The sun dipped lower, painting the plains in amber and long shadows. As they crossed the creek, the sound of water against stone filled the silence, a small, fragile sound in the vastness. Jonas slowed the horse to let it drink. Evelyn touched the edge of her veil, adjusting it against the wind. Beneath it, her breath caught. She thought of the letter she'd written months ago, her neat handwriting on paper that smelled faintly of lavender, promising she'd be a good wife to a man she'd never met, promising she could start again. Now, sitting beside him, she wondered if he could see the lie hidden inside that promise, that she wasn't sure she believed in beginnings anymore. Jonas glanced at her, then looked away quickly, ashamed of the instinct. "Wasn't sure you'd come," he said, eyes fixed on the reins. "I almost didn't," she replied. He nodded. The reins creaked in his hands. "Well, you're here now?" The wagon kept moving, the road winding between low hills and yellow grass. The wind rose again, carrying a scent of pine and smoke from some far-off homestead. For the first time in a long while, Jonas felt the urge to speak, to fill the air with something other than silence, but every word that came to mind felt too small. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small flask, and offered it to her. She hesitated, then took a sip. The whiskey burned her throat, but it steadied her. She handed it back, the edge of her glove brushing his knuckles. A small, accidental touch, but enough to make both aware of the space between them. As the ranch came into view, a weathered house, a barn leaning into the wind, fences stretching toward the horizon. Evelyn felt something loosen inside her. Fear, maybe, or the faint, surprising sense that she'd reached a place that wouldn't demand beauty from her. Jonas stopped the wagon, set the brake, and climbed down. He turned, offering his hand again. She took it. Her fingers lingered this time, not out of affection, but for balance. The ground beneath her boots felt uncertain, like the start of a road she hadn't planned to take. They stood there a moment, not speaking, while the sky bled into the color of old copper. A breeze stirred the daisies in his hand. He'd forgotten he was still holding them. He looked at the flowers, then at her, and managed a quiet, almost embarrassed smile. "They're for you," he said. She took them, holding them close to her chest as if unsure what to do next. "Thank you," she whispered. The veil moved with her breath, catching the last of the sun. Jonas nodded once, then tipped his hat. "Welcome home, Miss Moore?" For a second, she almost believed it. The sun hung low, spreading long ribbons of gold across the open plain. The wagon moved steady, the horse breathing soft clouds into the cooling air. Jonas held the reins loosely, eyes fixed on the road, though his thoughts wandered somewhere quieter. Evelyn sat beside him, her hands folded neatly on her lap, the gray lace of her veil catching the light like thin smoke. Neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't heavy, just cautious, like two people walking on new ice. A mile passed, then another. The sound of the wheels became the only rhythm in the world. From time to time, the wind would lift the edge of her veil, revealing just the faint outline of her chin, the pale curve of her neck. Jonas didn't look, but he noticed the way a man notices weather changing, quietly, without meaning to. At the bend near the creek, he shifted, reached up to tighten the strap of his hat. His hand brushed the air near her face, not a touch, just the ghost of one. She flinched, then turned toward him, her voice breaking the stillness for the first time since they left town. "Don't," she whispered, barely louder than the wind. Her gloved fingers gripped the veil's edge, pressing it back against her skin. "Please, don't." Jonas blinked, surprised. "Ma'am, I didn't mean..." Her head shook once. "I'm not... pretty." The word hung there, fragile and trembling, before the wind carried them off into the dusk. He looked at her, then not through the veil, but through the tremor in her voice. A kind of hurt that didn't come from the surface. He turned back to the reins. "That's fine," he said, slow and even. "I need honest, not fancy." And that was all. No flourish, no attempt to comfort her beyond the truth. The road stretched ahead, pale and endless. A hawk circled high above them, its cry sharp against the sky. Evelyn stared straight ahead, her fingers loosening. The words he'd said settled somewhere deep, where the ache had been too long unspoken. The wagon creaked over the last ridge before the ranch. The land opened wide fences like thin scars on the earth, the barn leaning slightly toward the west wind. Smoke drifted from the chimney, carrying the scent of cedar and ash. Jonas slowed the horse, his shoulders easing with the familiarity of home. "You can rest once we unload," he said. "Supper'll be simple. Bread, beans, maybe stew if the fire's kind." Evelyn nodded, still quiet. The rhythm of his voice steady. Practical steadied her, too. She watched the way he moved, unhurried, every gesture deliberate, as if he'd learned patience the hard way. When the wagon stopped, Jonas stepped down first. He turned, offering his hand again. This time, she took it without hesitation. The step down was small, but her breath caught all the same, the dust rising around her boots. Inside the house, light filtered through thin curtains, touching worn furniture and the dull shine of brass on a mantel clock. Everything smelled faintly of oil, leather, and time. Evelyn set her small bag on the table, uncertain where to stand next. Jonas removed his hat, ran a hand through hair still marked by the sun. "Ain't much," he said quietly, "but it's home." She looked around the single chair by the window, the kettle hanging over cold ash, the faint creak of the floorboards that told her this place had been lonely for too long. "It's peaceful," she said. He nodded. "That it is." For a while, they both stood there, unsure of what to do with their hands, their voices, or each other. Then Jonas moved to the stove, poured water into a dented kettle, and lit the fire with practiced ease. The smell of smoke filled the room, mingling with something softer, the faint scent of mint leaves he'd crushed into her tea. He poured a cup, set it on the table near her. "Mint helps with the dry air," he said. She reached for it carefully, the veil still in place. Through the lace, he could see the small tremor of her lips as she murmured, "Thank you." Jonas sat across from her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. He studied the fire instead of her, the flames reflected in his eyes steady, unflinching. "You can keep the veil if you want," he said finally. "Or not. Makes no difference to me." Her breath faltered. She looked up, startled by the gentleness in his tone. You don't wonder he shook his head. "No, some things ain't my business till a person wants them to be." The clock ticked in the quiet. Outside, a coyote called somewhere beyond the ridge long, mournful, fading into nothing. Evelyn's hands tightened around the cup, feeling its warmth seep through her gloves. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like judgment. It felt like room to breathe. Jonas stood, adjusting his coat. "There's a spare room at the back," he said. "I'll fetch more firewood before the cold hits." She nodded again. When he stepped outside, the door closed with a soft click. Evelyn remained seated, staring at the daisies still lying on the counter, a little wilted now, dust on their petals. She picked them up, one by one, and placed them into an empty jar near the window. The stems leaned, imperfect and uneven. Somehow, that made them beautiful. She removed her gloves, tracing the rim of the teacup. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the surface, distorted by the ripples of a heat. Beneath the veil, her throat tightened. The words he'd said replayed in her mind, quiet and impossible to forget. I need honest, not fancy. Outside, Jonas split kindling with slow, even strikes. Each swing of the axe echoed softly in the dusk. He worked by instinct, letting the rhythm calm him. There was something in her voice earlier, that trembling confession that had caught him off guard. Not pity, not curiosity, just the quiet ache of recognizing another kind of brokenness. When he came back in, the fire had grown steady, painting the room in amber. Evelyn stood by the window, her veil lit from behind like a thin halo. She didn't turn when he entered. He set the wood aside and took a breath, meaning to speak, but something about her stillness made him stop. "Good night, Mrs. Moore," he said at last, his voice a low murmur. "Good night." She answered, her tone soft, uncertain, but warmer than before. He lingered a second longer, then tipped his hat and walked out. Evelyn stood alone, the house breathing around her. The lace of her veil stirred in the draft, brushing her cheek like a whisper from the past. She looked toward the door, where his shadow had disappeared, and for the first time since arriving, she felt the faintest flicker of safety, small, fragile, but real. She turned back to the daisies, reached out, and straightened one stem that had fallen sideways. The bloom leaned toward the firelight, stubborn and alive. The first light of day slipped through the thin curtains, spilling across the wooden floorboards of the Walker Ranch house. Dust floated in slow circles, turning gold in the sunbeam that crept toward the kitchen table. Evelyn stood by the window, her hands wrapped around a tin cup that had long gone cold. Her veil caught the light, trembling slightly each time the breeze slipped in through the crack of the window frame. Outside, Jonas was already awake. She could hear him through the open pane, the steady rhythm of boots on dry earth, the creak of the barn door, the low murmur of a horse being led out to the corral. He didn't whistle, didn't speak to the animals like most men did. He just worked quiet, certain, every sound belonging to the land itself. Every morning, before he left, he placed a cup of mint tea on the porch rail, always the same cup chipped at the rim and beside it, a small folded note in his careful handwriting. Fixing the north fence today, taking the mare to the creek, storm coming by Thursday. Simple words, no flourish. Yet every one of them carried something steadier than affection, a kind of regard that didn't ask for anything in return. She never answered the notes, but she kept them all, slipped them into the top drawer of her small desk, folded neat as prayers. Sometimes, in the long hours of afternoon, she'd take one out and trace the letters with her finger, the paper soft from being held too often. It had been a week since she arrived. She worked from dawn to dusk, tending the chickens, scrubbing the floorboards, mending the shirts he left on the chair by the door. She kept her veil on through it all, even when the heat pressed close and sweat gathered beneath the lace. It was the only barrier she had left, between who she was and what the world saw. Jonas never asked her to remove it. He never even looked at it for longer than he had to. That, more than anything, unsettled her and eased her, too. One afternoon, while she hung wet linens on the line, the wind picked up, the sheets billowed like ghosts, snapping at the wooden pins. Jonas rode in from the north field, a trail of dust rising behind his horse. He dismounted and walked past her with a nod, carrying a coil of rope over his shoulder. She wanted to speak, say thank you for the tea, for the quiet he left her, but the words stuck like dry bread in her throat. He paused halfway to the barn, sensing her hesitation. Maybe, then, without turning, he said, "You'll want to bring those in before dark. The wind carries grit from the ridge," she murmured. "Yes." He nodded once, continued on. For a moment, she watched him the way his shoulders filled the doorway, how the late sun caught the sweat on the back of his neck. He was built like the land rough, enduring, marked by weather and work. She wondered if he'd always been this quiet, or if silence was something he'd learned after losing too much. The days fell into rhythm. He rose before dawn. She cooked by the time he came in at noon. They shared the same table, but rarely more than a few words. Yet something about that silence grew less sharp as time went on, like a knife dulled by use, turning into something that could be held without bleeding. Sometimes, she'd hear him humming low and rough when he thought she wasn't near. Once, she found herself pausing at the doorway, listening to that voice mingle with the soft scrape of a whetstone against a blade. It was a sound that didn't ask for attention. It simply filled the air where loneliness used to live. That night, she sat by the window, the sky wide and full of stars she didn't yet know the names of. The land hummed with its quiet life coyotes calling, the wind sighing through dry grass. Jonas walked by outside, carrying a lantern toward the barn. The light swung gently in his hand, gold and steady. She watched him until the darkness swallowed the glow. In her lap, another note lay unfolded, fixed the gate by the creek. The handwriting slanted slightly to the right, confident but tired. She pressed the paper to her chest. Beneath the lace, her heartbeat felt like something rediscovering its rhythm. The next morning, he found the cup empty, the note gone. Nothing else changed, no words, no thanks. But he noticed the way the porch rail had been dusted clean, the cup turned just so, as if in silent return. That evening, as the sun bled into the hills, Evelyn stood by the fence, watching the sky turn from copper to blue. Jonas approached, leading his horse. He stopped beside her, resting his hand on the top rail. They didn't speak. The world around them seemed to pause, even the wind. After a long silence, he said quietly, "The nights here get lonely. If you let 'em." She turned slightly, the veil catching the dying light. "I'm used to lonely." He nodded, eyes on the horizon. "Still, doesn't mean it ought to stay that way." The words hung between them, soft and uncertain. He didn't look at her after that, just led the horse away. But she stayed by the fence long after the stars appeared, the sound of his boots fading into the dark. When she finally went inside, she lit the lamp and found another note on the table. "Built a new co-op door. Needs painting soon." She smiled behind the veil, folded it carefully, and placed it with the others. That night, she dreamed of the wind, not the cruel one that carried sand and rumor, but the kind that whispered across open fields, brushing against a man's sleeve and a woman's veil, asking nothing, promising nothing, yet leaving the world softer for passing through. By late October, the wind had changed. It carried with it more than just dust. Now it carried words. Hollow Bend was a small place, and small places had a way of turning quiet into talk. At first, it was whispers on the boardwalk, the kind that slipped beneath the brim of a hat. Then it was full sentences over coffee, laughter that wasn't kind, and stories that grew teeth the more they were told. Jonas Walker's new wife, they said, the one who hides her face, scarred, they say, or worse, wouldn't show her face even to God. The sound of it reached him like the low rattle of a snake you don't see yet, but know is near. Jonas had come to town that morning for feed and nails. The sky was wide and white, the kind of cold light that made every sound feel louder. He tied his horse outside the general store, dusted off his hat, and stepped inside. The bell over the door gave its tired jingle, and every head in the room turned, just long enough to look, then look away. He walked slow, deliberate, the way a man does when he knows he's being measured. He didn't meet their eyes, just tipped his hat to old Mr. Dugan behind the counter and asked for what he needed. While Dugan filled the order, Jonas heard a woman's voice from near the shelves. "I heard she won't take that veil off, not even in the house." A man chuckled. "Can't blame her. They say she's got the kind of face that'd curdle milk." The laughter that followed was small, nervous, like folks testing how far they could go before shame caught up. Jonas turned his head just enough for the words to stop hanging in the air. His voice came out steady, quiet, but sharp enough to slice through the room. She doesn't need to be pretty to be kind. Silence fell. Even the creak of the floorboards seemed to hush. Jonas didn't say more. He didn't have to. He paid for his things, gathered the sack of feed under one arm, and walked back out into the wind. The bell clanged again, softer this time. Outside, the sky had gone the color of pewter. Jonas stood for a moment on the boardwalk, his jaw tight, his breath leaving little clouds in the chill. Across the street, a group of men from the livery turned away quickly, pretending to busy themselves with ropes and harness. The truth was, they weren't bad men, just small-town men, bored and mean when they forgot their own scars. Jonas loaded the supplies onto the wagon, the leather reins creaking in his hands. He didn't hurry, but there was weight in the way he moved. Each motion, simple and slow, carried the kind of anger that never needed shouting. As he turned the wagon toward home, the wind picked up, pushing against his back. He let it carry the dust, the noise, and every cruel word that had been spoken. None of it would reach her. He'd make sure of that. The road back to the ranch was long and quiet. The light faded early, turning the prairie into a gray sea. When he reached the gate, he saw the glow of a lamp in the kitchen window. She was inside, moving slowly, her shadow crossing the curtains like a passing thought. He tied the horse and climbed the steps. The porch creaked beneath his boots. There, on the rail, as always, was the cup, the one she'd cleaned and set out that morning. He touched it lightly, almost a habit now, then stepped inside. Evelyn looked up when he entered, her veil still in place, her hands dusted with flour. She'd been baking bread. The smell filled the room, warm, sweet, alive. He set the sack on the table. "Got what we needed?" he said. She nodded. "Thank you." Jonas hesitated, untying his scarf, the cold still clinging to him. "You been all right here?" "Yes," she said softly. "It's quiet." He gave a small smile. "Quiet's good." For a long while, neither spoke. The sound of the fire filled the room, wood crackling slow and steady. Then, without looking at her, Jonas said, "Folks in town, they talk too much. Don't pay them any mind." Her hands froze, just a second. The rolling pin stilled against the dough. "They're talking about me." He didn't answer right away. He could have lied, said no, brushed it off, but he'd promised himself never to add another weight to her shoulders by pretending the world was kind when it wasn't. "Yeah," he said finally. "They're wrong, but they talk anyway." The silence that followed wasn't soft this time. It had edges. Evelyn turned away, her shoulders stiff. "They always do?" Her voice cracked at the end, so faint he might have missed it if he hadn't been listening close. Jonas moved closer, not enough to touch her, just near enough for his voice to reach without breaking. "You don't owe them anything. Let them talk till their mouths dry out. You got no reason to hide from people who don't know what it means to be brave." She didn't move, but her breath hitched the kind that happens when words you don't expect find their mark. He turned then, started toward the door. "Bread smells good," he said quietly. "You'll want to pull it out soon." And with that, he stepped outside into the cold night, giving her back the space she needed. Out on the porch, Jonas leaned against the rail, the same one where the cup rested each morning. The stars were coming out slow, one by one, shy of the wind. He took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and let out a long, steady breath. He thought of the look on her face when she asked if they were talking about her, not angry, not afraid, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying too much silence for too long. He looked down at the ground, at the marks his boots had left in the dust, then toward the barn where the horses shifted in their stalls. Somewhere deep in him, an old part of his heart stirred the part that used to believe you could still stand between someone and the world if you tried hard enough. Inside, Evelyn pulled the bread from the oven. The crust cracked open, steam curling into the air. She stood there, the warmth touching her face through the lace. For a moment, She thought of taking it off just to feel the air, but instead, she set the bread on the sill next to the jar of wilted daisies and whispered to the quiet room, "He's kind." The wind outside carried her words away, scattering them into the night. Jonas stayed on the porch, watching the horizon fade into darkness. He didn't know if kindness was enough to fix what the world had done to her, but he knew it was the only thing he had to give. Night settled heavy over the Walker Ranch. The sound of crickets filled the stillness, weaving into the rhythm of the ticking mantel clock. Jonas had turned in early, his boots resting neatly by the door, his hat hanging on its usual nail. Evelyn sat alone at the table, a single sheet of paper laid before her, blank except for the soft indentation of her pen where she'd been pressing without writing. The oil lamp hissed faintly. She dipped the pen into ink, let the nib hover for a moment, then began to write. "Dear Clara." Her handwriting came slow, uneven, like someone learning to speak again after too long a silence. She hadn't written to her old friend in over a year, not since the letter that carried news of the broken engagement, and the fire, and the way people stopped meeting her eyes afterward. The words moved across the page in thin, trembling lines. "I arrived safely in Wyoming. The land is wide here, empty and loud at the same time. My husband, Mr. Walker, is kind. He doesn't speak much, but I think that's what kindness sounds like in this place." She paused. The ink pooled at the tip of her pen. Outside, the wind whispered along the boards, rattling the latch. The sound reminded her of Virginia, of nights she used to spend in her parents' house, the soft murmur of cicadas beyond the window, the smell of linen dried under gentler skies. That world felt 1,000 miles and a lifetime away. She touched the edge of her veil, feeling its rough lace between her fingers. The habit had become instinct, a tether between her and the reflection she'd stopped looking at long ago. "There are mornings when I almost forget to put it on," she wrote. "Then I remember, and I don't know if it's shame or protection anymore. Maybe both." She set the pen down and looked at the small jar of daisies by the window. Their petals dry now, but still holding the faint memory of color. Jonas had cut them from the field the first day she came. He never mentioned them again, but he replaced them once, quietly, when they had turned brittle and gray. A faint warmth stirred in her chest. "He brings me tea every morning, mint, from the plants growing near the creek. He doesn't ask questions, doesn't look too long. I think he understands what it means to leave a thing alone until it's ready to be seen." The words stopped there. She stared at the page, the curve of the letters fading slightly as the ink dried. For a long moment, she listened to the sounds of the house breathing the soft groan of the wood, the distant stamp of a horse shifting in its stall. Her eyes drifted toward the mirror on the wall. It was small, with a crack running through one corner, but still enough to hold her reflection if she dared. She hadn't looked straight at herself in months. Not since that night when the flame had leapt from the hearth to her dress and the world had turned into fire and screams. Her hand moved before her courage caught up. She lifted the veil slowly, just enough for air to touch her cheek. The lamplight reached her skin, tracing the ridged mark that ran from her jaw to her temple, pale, uneven, alive with memory. The sight still hurt, but not as much as it once did. A single tear slid down, catching in the lace before falling to the paper below. Smearing a line of ink, she closed her eyes, let the tear dry where it fell, and took another breath. "I'm learning to live quieter," she wrote. "Not to hide, but to stay still until the noise inside settles. He helps, without knowing he does." There's something honest about the way he moves through this world, like every scar it's given him, just taught him where not to walk again. Her pen paused once more. The lamplight dimmed as the oil burned low. Evelyn sat back, looking at what she had written. It wasn't much, barely half a page, but it carried everything she hadn't said aloud. She thought of mailing it in the morning, imagined Clara opening it, reading each word, feeling the distance stretch and soften between them. But the thought brought a strange weight. The letter was too raw, too close to something she wasn't ready to share. Instead, she folded it carefully, pressing the edges straight, then slipped it into the pocket of her coat hanging by the door. Some things, she realized, were meant to be written, not sent. The clock chimed softly, marking the hour. Evelyn blew out the lamp. Darkness folded around her, thick and gentle. She walked toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the yard bathed in moonlight. Jonas was out there, near the barn. She could make out his shape against the pale light moving slow, checking the gate. He always did that before turning in. It wasn't just habit. It was his way of keeping the world safe for those inside. For her. She stood there for a while, watching him, the letter pressing faintly against her heart through the fabric of her dress. Then she whispered to the quiet, "You don't have to be kind, but you are, and that's enough." The words were too soft to reach him, but they settled into the still air, warm as breath. Later, when she lay in bed, she could still hear him walking back to the house, the familiar creak of the porch step, the slow closing of the door. The bed dipped slightly as he moved through the next room. She didn't speak, didn't move, just listened to the small proof that someone else was there, that this quiet life had begun to gather shape around them both. In the dark, her fingers brushed the edge of her veil, then dropped away. Maybe tomorrow, she thought, she would take it off just for a moment and let the morning light find her face again. Outside, the wind was rising. It moved through the dry grass, brushing against the walls of the ranch like a restless hand. Inside, the lamp burned steady, a small island of light in the dim room. Evelyn sat near the window, mending the cuff of Jonas's shirt. The needle moved with quiet rhythm, in and out of the fabric, her breath steady with it. From the corner of her eye, she saw him sitting by the table, hat off, shoulders bent a little, the lines of his face caught in the glow of the fire. In front of him sat a wooden box, old and worn, the kind that had traveled miles and years to end up here. He'd never opened it in her presence before. She didn't mean to look, but when the lid creaked open, her hand stopped mid-stitch. Inside lay a few folded letters, a silver ring, and a photograph. The picture caught the light, a woman, smiling softly, her hair pinned neat, eyes full of summer. Evelyn looked away, guilt washing over her like heat, but Jonas's voice broke the quiet before she could stand. "She hated this land," he said. The words came slow, like he was talking more to the fire than to her. Said it smelled of iron and loneliness. Evelyn turned her head slightly. Who was she? He didn't hesitate. "My wife. Before." He lifted the photograph, thumb brushing the edge of the paper. Said she loved me, but she loved the city more. One morning, she packed her things and took the eastbound stage. Didn't say goodbye, didn't even leave a note. The log in the fire split with a soft hiss. Evelyn set the shirt down on her lap, fingers still gripping the fabric. Jonas looked at the photo a long time before setting it back inside the box. I waited for her to come back. A year, maybe more. Kept the place up like she might ride in any day. His voice thinned, but time don't bargain with fools. He closed the box gently, not out of regret, but respect. Evelyn wanted to speak, to offer something, even silence shaped like comfort. Instead, she found herself asking, "You never tried to find her?" He shook his head. "No, some things. You let the wind carry. If it brings them back, they were meant to stay. If not, you keep your hat down and ride on." His tone wasn't bitter, just steady, like a man who'd made peace with what couldn't be mended. For a long moment, neither moved. The only sound was the fire, the soft scrape of embers shifting. Evelyn looked at the wooden box. How simple it was, and yet how much it held. She wondered what people would find if they ever opened the one she kept hidden inside herself. Then Jonas spoke again. Quieter this time. "You ever lost something that kept on living inside you?" She breathed in, slow. "Yes." He nodded, as if he already knew. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was the kind that sits between two people who don't owe each other explanations, but give them anyway. Evelyn stared at the firelight dancing on the walls. "It's strange," she said softly. "People think scars mean something ended. But they're what's left when something survives." Jonas's gaze lifted to her, then steady, thoughtful. "That's truth. Right there." The flames wavered, throwing his face into shadow. For the first time, she saw the wear in him, the kind that doesn't show in muscle or bone, but in the eyes of someone who's buried too much hope. She wanted to ask about the woman, what her name was, what kind of laughter she had, what it felt like to lose someone who chose to leave, but she didn't. She'd learned that not all pain wanted words. Instead, she said, "You're not afraid." After all that Jonas looked into the fire, the orange light flickered across his face. "No," he said finally. "I'm not afraid of hurt. I'm afraid of lies. Hurt heals. Lies rot." His words hung there, deep and even. Evelyn felt them settle somewhere beneath her ribs. He reached for the poker, stirred the coals. Sparks lifted into the air, small and bright before fading. "Ain't much in this world that stays," he said quietly, "but truth that's worth holding, even when it burns." She watched him then, the calm in his movements, the care in how he placed the poker back beside the hearth. Something inside her, fragile but real, began to shift. Trust. Maybe. The light flickered against her veil. She could feel the warmth touch her skin through the lace. "I used to think people only stay if you're perfect," she said, "if you don't give them reason to look too close." Jonas leaned back in his chair. "Maybe the right ones stay because they do look close." The room grew still again. Outside, the wind had calmed, leaving behind the faint cry of an owl somewhere in the dark. Evelyn folded the shirt neatly, smoothing the sleeve before placing it on the table. Jonas closed the box and slid it aside. "You should rest," he murmured. She nodded, though her feet didn't move. The warmth from the fire reached her face, soft as breath. After a moment, she said, "Jonas, do you ever miss her?" He thought for a long while before answering. "Some nights, but mostly, I miss the man I was before she left." Evelyn's heart gave a quiet ache at that. She understood not his loss, but the way it lived in him, the way it mirrored her own reflection, not of the face she'd lost, but the woman she'd been before the fire. Jonas stood, stretching his shoulders. "You don't have to fear what's been seen," he said, half turning toward her. "You only fear what's been judged, and I ain't here to do that." Her breath caught. She didn't reply, but when he stepped past her, she reached out not to stop him, just to let her fingers brush the sleeve of his coat. A small, wordless thank you. He paused, just long enough for their eyes to meet through the dim light. Then he nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and walked toward the door. The wind had died completely now. The only sound left was the slow settling of embers. Evelyn looked back at the wooden box. The photograph's corner peeked out from under the lid. She reached forward, not to open it, but to set it straight, a quiet gesture of respect. Then she sat back, her hands still, her heart strangely lighter. The fire dimmed, the last flame bowing low. The afternoon had turned dark before anyone noticed. Clouds gathered over the ridge like bruises spreading across the sky. The wind came sudden, wild, carrying the scent of rain and dust, and something older, the kind of smell that makes animals restless. Evelyn stood by the window, the hem of her dress brushing her boots, watching the light fade out of the fields. The horses in the corral were pacing, their bodies gleaming with unease. Jonas came through the door, the storm at his back. His hat dripped rain, his coat slick with mud. "It's comin' fast," he said, voice raised over the rising wind. "We'll need to bar the stalls and pull the feed inside." Before she could answer, a sound split the air, a sharp, cracking roar from the barn. The roof had given way, the horses screamed, metal struck wood, and the wind howled through the gap like something alive. Jonas grabbed his coat again, but Evelyn was already moving. She ran past him, skirts tangling around her legs, veil snapping behind her like a torn flag. "Evelyn!" he shouted, but she didn't stop. The door banged open. flung wide by the storm, and she disappeared into the dark. Rain hit her face like stones. The world was a blur of gray and motion, wind pulling at her arms, mud sucking at her boots. She reached the barn just as another gust tore at the doors. The horses thrashed inside, eyes rolling white, ropes snapping loose. One mare had fallen against a broken beam, her flank pinned. Evelyn slipped through the opening, coughing through the dust and hay. "Easy now," she whispered, voice trembling but sure. "It's all right." She reached for the mare's bridle, the animal's breath hot and frantic against her sleeve. Wood cracked above her, a beam shifting, nails groaning loose. Evelyn ducked, pulling the horse's head close, trying to free the reins tangled around the post. Lightning flashed, filling the barn with white light. In that instant, something caught a nail, jagged and bent, snagged the edge of her veil. The fabric tore. The sound was small nothing against the roar of rain and wind, but to her, it was deafening. She froze, fingers halfway to the buckle, feeling the cool air hit her bare skin. The veil fluttered to the ground, half soaked, half clinging to her sleeve. For a heartbeat, she couldn't move. The instinct to cover her face rose like an old wound breaking open. But then, another sound, the frightened snort of the mare pulled her back. She tore the last strap free, guiding the animal out through the open door, into the storm. Jonas was there, fighting against the wind. He saw her coming, the horse stumbling beside her, the veil gone, her hair whipping wild in the rain. For a moment, he didn't move. The lightning struck again, and her face was laid bare, the pale line running from her neck to her cheek, glistening with water and light. Then he was beside her, his coat coming off in one motion. He wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling her close as the rain hammered down. He didn't look away, didn't speak. Just covered her, steady and quiet, until the shaking in her hands began to fade. The horse ran off into the open, free now, its hooves pounding through the mud. Evelyn stood still, breath ragged, the weight of the storm pressing against her chest. She could feel the warmth of his coat, the rough wool heavy with rain, his hand steady at her back. When she finally looked up, the fear in her eyes had shifted, not gone, but changed shape. She started, but the word broke apart in her throat. Jonas only shook his head. His voice, when it came, was low, barely more than the sound of the rain between them. "You did good." The storm kept on, but something inside her had gone quiet. They made their way back toward the house, the mud thick underfoot. The rain softened to a slow drizzle, the sky breaking open into faint light near the horizon. Jonas stayed close, guiding her by the elbow when she stumbled, saying nothing more. Inside, the fire had gone out. He took the lantern from the wall, lit it, and set it on the table. The flame trembled, throwing their shadows long across the room. Evelyn stood in the doorway, dripping, his coat still wrapped around her shoulders. The torn veil hung from her hand, a strip of gray lace, its edges frayed and dark with rain. He reached for it gently. "You can let that go," he said. Her fingers tightened. For a moment, she thought she couldn't. The veil had been her armor for so long, the one thing standing between her and the world's gaze. But now, under that flickering light, she looked at it just fabric, fragile and ordinary, and felt something in her chest unclench. Her hand opened, the lace slipped from her fingers, landing softly on the floor. Jonas knelt, picked it up, and laid it across the table. "It's just cloth," he said, his voice rough but kind. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Rain drummed softly against the windows. The wind outside was fading, leaving behind the steady rhythm of dripping eaves. Evelyn stood there, her face still damp, her breath slow. She felt raw, exposed in a way she hadn't been for years, but not broken. Jonas stepped closer, his eyes meeting hers. There was no surprise there, no pity, only a calm kind of truth. "You're safe," he said simply. Her lips trembled once, then steadied. "I thought I'd forgotten what the rain felt like," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "It's honest. Doesn't care who it falls on." That made her laugh small, shaky but real, and in that sound, the heaviness between them shifted into something else. Jonas reached up, brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, then stopped himself, letting his hand fall. "Get dry," he said softly. "I'll see to the horses." As he turned away, she watched the way his shadow moved across the wall, solid, unhurried, familiar. The house felt different now, filled with something warm even as rain still whispered outside. Evelyn walked to the window, watching him disappear into the mist, the lantern in his hand glowing gold against the gray. She lifted a hand to her cheek, tracing the line of her scar, not hiding it, just feeling it. And for the first time, she didn't wish it away. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt alive. The walls still whispered with the memory of rain. Outside, puddles mirrored the moonlight, the earth breathing steam into the cold night air. Inside, Evelyn sat near the hearth, Jonas's coat draped over her shoulders. The torn veil lay folded beside her, not hidden, not forgotten, just resting there like a thing finally done with its duty. Jonas sat across from her, one elbow on his knee, turning his hat in slow circles between his hands. The fire threw soft light across his face, catching the lines at the corners of his eyes, the marks of a man who had seen both laughter and loss, and learned not to run from either. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sound was the slow crackle of the wood, the quiet pop of a burning knot. Evelyn watched the flames rise and fall, her reflection trembling in the glass of the window behind them. Her cheek still glistened faintly where rain had kissed it, and beneath that, the old scar, shining soft as silver in the light. When she finally spoke, her voice came small, fragile, as if afraid to disturb the peace the storm had left behind. "I should have stayed hidden." Jonas looked up, his eyes steady, unflinching. "Why's that?" Her hands folded together in her lap. "Because people stare. Because they always have. Back home. They'd whisper before I even walked into a room." She paused, the next word scraping against the back of her throat. "I used to think if I could just hide it long enough, I'd stop being the woman they pitied." Jonas leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching the edge of his jaw. "You think hiding makes him forget?" She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping. "No, it just makes me forget who I am." The silence after that was heavy, but not cruel. He watched her a long time, then set his hat down gently on the floor. "Evelyn," he said, his tone quiet but firm, "I don't care what people see when they look at you. I care about what they don't see." She blinked, uncertain. "And what's that?" "The kind of heart that runs into a storm to save what's scared." Her breath caught. For a second, neither moved. The fire cracked again, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "You're not afraid of it?" she asked finally, her voice almost a whisper. "Of me?" Jonas met her eyes, unflinching. "I don't need a perfect face. I need an honest heart." The words landed between them, quiet and certain, no louder than the sigh of the flame, but strong enough to still everything else. Evelyn's lips parted, as if to answer, but no words came. Instead, her eyes filled, tears glinting in the low light. She looked away quickly, ashamed of the trembling in her hands. Jonas didn't move to comfort her. He just sat there, letting the silence hold them both. Sometimes kindness needed no closer distance. The tears came harder then, sudden and unguarded, not from sorrow, not entirely. It was something deeper, older, washing out years of shame she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The sound of it, small, uneven, filled the room like rain on soft earth. She pressed a hand to her face, the warmth of her palm against the cool scar. "You don't know what it's like," she murmured, "to see people look away." Jonas's voice was low, a rough murmur shaped by truth. "You're wrong. I do." Her eyes lifted, red-rimmed, questioning. He turned his gaze toward the fire, the light flickering over his hands. "This land. It changes people, makes them harder than they mean to be. I've watched good men turn mean, watched kind women give up. I've buried folks I loved. and I've been left behind by ones who swore they wouldn't go. You start thinking maybe it's your fault. The way they look at you like loss is something you carry on your skin. He looked back at her then, his voice softer still. But it ain't. It's just the way life marks us. Some on the outside, some where no one can see. Evelyn's tears slowed. She stared into the fire again, its glow blurring through the water in her eyes. The weight in her chest eased, bit by bit, replaced by something she couldn't yet name. The room settled into stillness once more. Jonas stood after a while, walking to the small cupboard. He poured her a cup of tea mint, as always, and brought it to her side. When she took it, their fingers brushed, just briefly. His hand was warm, rough, alive. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, almost a bow, and returned to his chair. For a long time, neither spoke. The wind outside had calmed, leaving only the soft rustle of branches against the roof. The world felt smaller, gentler, as if it, too, was listening. Evelyn lifted the cup, breathed in the steam. The scent of mint and smoke curled around her, wrapping her in quiet. Her eyes wandered to Jonas, the set of his shoulders, the steady rhythm of his breath. Something about him had changed in the firelight, not his shape, but the way the light found him, as though the shadows had finally learned where to rest. She thought of how he'd looked at her outside, not with pity, not even with surprise, just with understanding, and she realized, with a sudden, fragile clarity, that she wasn't afraid anymore. Jonas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You don't have to hide from me, Evelyn," he said. "Not now, not ever." Her throat tightened. She set the cup down carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. Then, before she could think better of it, she reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, not to hide, but to show. The scar caught the firelight again, soft and uneven, a pale line tracing the story she had tried to bury. Jonas didn't look away. His eyes stayed steady, kind. And in that gaze, she felt something inside her, something long frozen begin to thaw. The fire snapped, sending a single spark into the air before dying back into embers. Evelyn smiled faintly, though tears still shone on her cheeks. "I don't know if I remember how to be seen," she said. Jonas's voice came low, steady as the heartbeat of the room. "Then I'll remind you, one day at a time." Neither spoke after that. There was nothing left that needed saying. The air between them filled with the quiet hum of trust, thin at first, but growing stronger, like a string pulled tight enough to make music. Evelyn drew her knees closer, the warmth of the fire finding her face. For the first time since coming to this land, she didn't reach for the veil. She didn't need to. The storm had left the land clean, but quiet, too quiet. Puddles shimmered on the dirt road leading into Hollow Bend, and the wind carried the faint creak of wagon wheels from somewhere down the valley. Evelyn stood on the porch, hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold, her eyes tracing the horizon as if the silence itself might speak. Jonas had gone early to the north pasture, said something about fixing the broken fence. She'd nodded without answering. There had been more silence between them lately, not the comfortable kind that once warmed her, but a new, heavier sort, like both were afraid of saying too much and breaking whatever they had begun to build. She could still feel the weight of his words from that night by the fire. "I need an honest heart." They'd settled deep inside her, too deep. Maybe, and now, every time she caught her reflection in the window, she found herself wondering what honesty really meant, showing your scars, or pretending they no longer hurt. By noon, she saddled the old bay mare and rode into town. The trail was dry again, dust rising behind her in a soft brown ribbon. The closer she got, the more the noise of Hollow Bend began to hum hammers from the blacksmith, a dog barking somewhere near the general store. The slow rhythm of a town trying to forget it was dying. Inside the mercantile, the air smelled of flour, leather, and tobacco. Mrs. Dugan stood behind the counter, her apron dusted white. A few townsfolk lingered near the shelves, eyes darting quick like sparrows when Evelyn walked in. She could feel their looks slide over her polite, then not. She picked up a sack of beans, another of sugar, and set them on the counter. The room felt smaller suddenly, as though the walls leaned in to listen. Then it came the voice, sweet as syrup, sharp as a blade. "Well, look who's brave enough to show her face again," a woman near the barrels said, her words carrying too clearly. "If I had a scar like that, I'd keep it hidden till kingdom come." The air went still. Even the dog outside stopped barking. Evelyn's hand froze on the counter, the bag of beans slipping slightly in her grip. "Mrs. Dugan cleared her throat, but no one spoke. The woman chuckled that small, ugly sound that only exists to fill other people's shame. Some folks just don't know when to stay out of sight. Evelyn didn't answer. Her voice wouldn't have made it past her lips even if she tried. She paid, lifted the bag, and walked out. Each step measured, slow. Outside, the sunlight hit her too bright. It felt like the whole town was watching through the glass windows and half-open doors. Her throat burned. She wanted to be strong, wanted to let those words slide off her like the dust on her boots, but strength has a limit, and she'd reached hers. By the time she reached the edge of town, her hands were shaking on the reins. The ride home felt longer than it should have. The land stretched out wide and merciless, its beauty offering no comfort, only reflection. The words kept circling in her head, louder with every mile. If I had a scar like that. She didn't cry. She just rode until the house came into view, small, lonely, honest. Jonas's horse was still gone from the corral. The porch creaked under her boots as she stepped inside. The air was still warm from the morning fire. His jacket hung by the door, her folded veil still lying where she'd left it days ago. She set the bags down and went to the table. For a long moment, she stared at the wooden surface, at the scratches and stains and quiet evidence of their life together. Then she reached for a piece of paper. The pen felt heavy in her hand. She didn't write much, just a few words, the only ones that mattered. "I wanted to be enough, but maybe I never will be." The ink bled slightly where her hand trembled. She folded the note once, neat, and left it beside the small jar of dried daisies Jonas had replaced just last week. Her eyes drifted toward the window. Outside, the light was fading, the kind that stretches long and gold across the plains, turning everything beautiful just before it disappears. She went to her room, took the coat from the peg, and slipped it on. Her hand brushed the back of a chair. His chair as she passed. For a heartbeat, she almost turned back. But sometimes the ache of staying is worse than the fear of leaving. The screen door creaked softly behind her. She stepped out into the evening. The sky stretched wide, purple bleeding into orange. The wind had picked up again, soft but certain, carrying the smell of rain far away. She walked to the barn, untied the mare, and climbed into the saddle. No rush, just motion. The kind that makes you feel less like running and more like fading into the land that's always been too big to hold anyone's sorrow for long. The house behind her grew small. Its windows glowed faintly, the kind of light that waits for someone to come home. She didn't look back, not yet. The road wound through the low hills, quiet except for the steady rhythm of hooves and the whisper of wind in the grass. A coyote called somewhere far off. Evelyn felt the sound pass through her, hollow but gentle. When the last light slipped beneath the horizon, she slowed the mare. The land spread endless in every direction, and for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of being seen, only of being forgotten. She pulled Jonas's coat tighter around her shoulders, the smell of leather and smoke wrapping her like memory. The note on the table, small, simple, unfinished, stayed behind. A whisper she hoped he'd hear even after she was gone. Jonas rode hard. The world around him blurred into shadow and motion, the horse's hooves striking sparks off the stones of the trail. He didn't stop to rest, didn't slow to breathe. Every mile stretched longer than the last. The only thing that kept him steady was the thought of her, the image of Evelyn riding alone into the dark, the note she'd left behind still burning in his pocket. "I wanted to be enough." The words cut deeper with every gallop, The moon rose high and thin, painting the land in silver edges. He passed the hollow creek, the dead cottonwood, the stretch of open prairie that led toward the mountains. Each place whispered pieces of their days together, the laughter she hadn't meant to let slip. The way she'd looked at him by firelight, the gentleness in her hands when she spoke to the horses. Now the land felt empty without her. By dawn, the peaks of Gray Ridge came into view, dark blue against a bruised sky. He knew this country. It was where she'd said her mother lived. A quiet cabin, up past the last bend of the trail. The climb was steep, the air thin. His horse, drenched in sweat, stumbled once, but kept on. Jonas murmured a few low words, not prayers, just promises. The cabin appeared at last small, leaning, a thin wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. He slowed, slid from the saddle, and knocked on the weathered door. It opened after a moment. A woman stood there, gray-haired and tired, her eyes sharp despite the lines carved deep around them. She held a shawl tight around her shoulders. "Can I help you?" Mr. Jonas took off his hat, his voice rough from dust and miles. "Ma'am, I'm looking for Evelyn Moore." The woman studied him a moment before answering. "She's here. Been here since last night. Sleeping now?" Her tone softened just slightly. "You're the husband, aren't you?" He nodded once. "She told me you were kind." Jonas looked down, his hand tightening around the brim of his hat. "I tried to be." The woman opened the door wider. "Come in. It's cold out." He stepped inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and old quilts. The walls were hung with faded photographs, a younger version of the woman, a man in a soldier's coat, and in the corner, a worn Bible lying open. "Sit," she said, pointing toward a chair by the hearth. "She's resting in the next room. Been through a lot. That girl." Jonas stayed standing, his gaze drifting to the door she'd disappeared behind. "I shouldn't have let her go." Her mother gave a small smile, tired but knowing. "You men always think you can stop a woman's hurt by holding her tighter. But sometimes, son, she's got to walk it out on her own." Jonas didn't answer. His throat worked once, hard. After a while, the woman sat down across from him. The firelight caught the soft tremor in her hands as she poured him a cup of coffee. "You probably heard the talk about her in town." He nodded. "They don't know the half of it," she said, her voice steady but edged with years of kept silence. That scar on her face. "They think it's vanity she hides from. But it's not shame she carries. It's pain the world wouldn't understand." Jonas looked up. The old woman's eyes were far away now, seeing something else. There was a fire. 2 winters ago. Church caught from a lantern. Whole place went up. Fast roof beams fell before folks could run. A little boy was trapped inside. Her cousin's child. Evelyn ran back in, dragged him out before the wall gave. But the fire caught her too. She took a long breath. They never thanked her, never said her name in church again. Just whispered that she should have stayed out. Folks forget quick. It's easier than feeling guilty. The fire popped. Jonas felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, exactly, but sorrow so deep it burned. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "do you know what kind of woman she is?" The old woman looked at him, waiting. Jonas's voice broke, just slightly. "She's the strongest soul I've ever met. The kind that stands in a storm and doesn't flinch. I've seen her face the things most folks would run from, not just fear, but kindness too. The kind that costs you to give." His hands trembled once, then stilled. "You should know that. You raised someone rare." The woman's eyes glistened. She reached across the table, laying her frail hand over his. "Thank you. Mr. Walker?" For a moment, the room was silent except for the hiss of the fire. In the next room, behind the thin wooden door, Evelyn stood in the shadows. She had woken when she heard his voice, the rough steadiness of it carrying through the walls. She hadn't meant to listen, but each word found her like light through cracks. Her mother's voice, gentle and worn, his, breaking on her name. When he said, "She's the strongest soul I've ever met," something inside her gave way. The tears came soundless, hot against her palms as she pressed them to her face. But for once, they didn't hurt. She hadn't known what she'd wanted him to feel when she left regret. Maybe, or anger. But hearing those words, she understood he hadn't come out of pride or pity. He came because he believed in her. Through the door, Jonas stood. His voice came low. "I'd like to see her, if she'll have me." Her mother nodded. "She's awake. She's been waiting, even if she doesn't know it yet." Jonas crossed to the door and paused, hand resting on the frame. He hesitated, a rare thing for him, then knocked once, soft enough that it sounded more like a promise than a request. The door creaked open. Evelyn stood by the window, her back to him. The light from the morning spilled across her hair, turning it gold at the edges. She didn't turn right away, afraid her voice might fail her before her courage did. "I heard you," she said finally. Jonas's breath caught. "Then you know it's true." She turned then, slow, her eyes shining. "Jonas, why did you come?" He took a step forward, hat in hand, every line of his face raw with exhaustion and something deeper. "Because you think you ain't enough, and I can't live in a world that lets you believe that." For a long time, she didn't move. The wind outside brushed against the cabin walls, soft as a sigh. Then she crossed the room, her bare feet silent on the wood. When she reached him, she stopped just close enough that he could see the trail her tears had left, the scar faint in the soft light. He didn't reach for her, didn't need to. In the quiet that followed, something passed between them, the kind of understanding that doesn't need forgiveness, only truth. Her lips trembled once, then curved into the smallest, realest smile, and for the first time since the fire, Evelyn felt her heart steady in her chest. Dawn had barely broken, and the sky was still half asleep, a dull gray washed with the faintest streaks of pink. The town lay quiet, shutters closed, smoke rising from a few lonely chimneys. He passed the blacksmith shop, the saloon, the church whose bell hadn't rung in months. Everything felt smaller somehow, quieter, as if the land itself knew it had wronged someone gentle. The old bay's hooves made soft thuds on the packed earth. Jonas's shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before, something steady, certain. He carried a small bundle tied behind his saddle, Evelyn's wedding dress. The fabric was creased and a little torn, the lace yellowed from time and dust. But when he untied it later, laying it across the table back home, it still smelled faintly of her wild mint and smoke, the scent of the woman who had walked into his life and taught him that silence could be soft, not empty. He sat for a while, elbows on the table, staring at that dress. The seams had loosened, one sleeve half torn from where she'd clutched it the day she left. Jonas wasn't a man for sewing, never had been, but he fetched a small kit from a drawer, the one he used to mend saddle straps and gloves. The needle looked clumsy in his rough hands. He threaded it anyway. The first stitch was crooked, the thread pulling too tight. The next one wasn't much better, but he kept going, slow and careful, breathing with each pull. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. The fire crackled low, its light falling across the white cloth like morning breaking on snow. He thought of her as he worked, her voice, the way she'd hesitated before laughing, as though unsure she had the right, the way she'd look at him when she thought he wasn't watching. By the time the sun reached the far hills, the last tear in the dress had been mended. Not perfectly, the stitches were uneven, the fabric puckered here and there, but it was whole again. And that, Jonas thought, was enough. He stood, stretched his stiff back, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was clean after last night's rain, the kind that made everything smell new. He carried the dress carefully, like something sacred, and hooked it to the beam above the porch where the wind could catch it. Then he brought out a plank of pine he'd been saving. He set it across his lap, took his knife, and began carving. The blade scraped soft against the wood, a slow rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The words came simple, not fancy, not poetic, just true. For the bravest woman I know. When he was done, he hung the sign beside the dress. The wind caught the cloth, lifting it gently, letting it sway in the morning light. Jonas stepped back, hat in hand. The house looked different now, not lonely, but waiting. He didn't go into town that day, though word traveled faster than he could have ridden. By noon, someone had seen it, old Mrs. Dugan, on her way to fetch flour. She stopped, squinting, her mouth softening as she read the sign. She stood a while, quiet, then turned back toward the road. By evening, a few others came. They didn't say much, just left small things under the porch, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of honey, wildflowers bound with twine. Nobody dared take the dress down. Nobody laughed. In the days that followed, the whispers that once cut like glass began to fade. People still talked, but their voices carried something different now, a touch of shame, maybe, or a wish to be better. The same mouths that once judged her now spoke her name with something close to respect. Jonas never said a word about it. He went about his chores as usual, fixing the fence, mending tack, tending the horses. But each morning, before he started, he'd pause at the porch, brush his fingers lightly against the hanging cloth, and look toward the horizon where the road disappeared into the hills. He didn't know if she'd see it, if someone might tell her, if word might find its way up to Gray Ridge. But he hoped, and hope, for a man like Jonas, was something close to prayer. One evening, near sundown, a little girl from town rode up with her father to deliver eggs. She pointed at the dress and asked what it was doing there. Jonas smiled, slow and sad, and said, "It belongs to someone good, someone who deserves to be remembered right." The girl nodded solemnly, like she understood something her father didn't. The wind picked up again that night, warm and restless. It carried the smell of sage and rain, and with it, a faint, imagined sound. The echo of a laugh, soft and uncertain, like the first note of a song trying to remember itself. Inside the house, Jonas sat by the fire, the sewing kit still open on the table. His hands, cracked and calloused, rested beside it. The flickering light reached the window, glinting off the glass and beyond it, the white of the dress swaying slow in the dusk. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, the quiet wrapping around him like an old friend. Somewhere out there, he knew. She was still walking her path, strong, brave, maybe even smiling now. And if she ever came back, she'd see what he'd built for her. Not a monument, not an apology, but a truth carved in wood and wind. Jonas stood by the fence, his hat low against the sinking sun. The boards creaked beneath his boots, the sound soft and old, like a memory remembering itself. In front of him, the prairie stretched wide and endless, each blade of grass trembling in the late light. The dress he'd hung days ago still swayed on the porch behind him, whispering with every gust of wind. He heard the sound before he saw her hooves on dry soil, slow and certain, the rhythm of someone coming home, not rushing, not fleeing, just returning. He turned. Evelyn rode toward him, her figure framed by the fading light, the wind tugging gently at her veil. She looked smaller than he remembered, not fragile, but real, like time had finally stripped away everything that wasn't meant to stay. When she stopped by the fence, neither spoke at first. The world around them filled the silence, the wind sighing through the grass, the faint creak of saddle leather, the soft breath she took before dismounting. Jonas stepped forward. The light caught his face, turning the tired lines around his eyes into something almost tender. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said, voice low. She smiled, faint but true. "Neither was I." He nodded once, like he understood exactly what that meant. For a long moment, they stood there, two people marked by the same kind of quiet, the kind that only comes after everything else has burned away. Then Evelyn's eyes lifted, catching sight of the porch. The dress moved gently in the wind, its fabric shimmering soft in the gold light. Beside it hung the wooden sign. She read the words, her lips parting just slightly. For the bravest woman I know. She turned back to him, her voice barely more than a whisper. Why did you do that? Jonas looked down at his hands, rough and scarred from years of work. Because some truths ought to be carved in wood, he said, so they don't blow away with talk. She took a step closer. You could have let them forget me. I didn't want to. The wind passed between them, lifting her veil, just enough that the last light of day brushed against her cheek. For the first time, she didn't reach for it. Her fingers moved slowly, untied the ribbon, and let the veil fall into the grass. The fabric landed softly, a whisper, a letting go. The light touched her face fully now. The scar, pale and delicate, caught the sun like a thread of silver. She met his gaze, steady, unflinching. I'm still not beautiful, she said. Jonas's voice came quiet, almost like prayer. That's fine. I never needed beautiful. He stepped closer, his shadow mingling with hers. I needed true. Her breath trembled, breaking into a sound that wasn't quite a sob and not yet a laugh. And then she smiled, not the shy, half-hid smile of someone waiting for permission, but something different. The kind that lives only in those who've been broken open and found there was still light inside. Jonas reached out, not to touch her face, but her hand small, cold, trembling. His thumb brushed the back of it, rough against soft. You can stay, he said simply. If you want, I do. The words left her lips like an exhale she'd been holding for years. Behind them, the sun dipped lower, the sky deepening into amber and violet. The porch, the fields, the whole of Hollow Bend seemed to glow for a moment, not with beauty, but with peace. The neighbors came quietly as the light faded. Mrs. Dugan brought a pie. The blacksmith's wife carried a jar of wildflowers. No one said much. They gathered near the fence, forming a loose circle around the couple, not to watch, not to judge, but to stand witness. Someone began to hum an old hymn, low and familiar. The sound carried softly across the fields. Jonas and Evelyn stood side by side, their hands still joined. There was no preacher, no grand vows, no crowd to applaud, just the wind, the hymn, the smell of wood smoke, and the slow turning of the world. When the song faded, Evelyn looked toward the horizon where the last of the sun sank into the earth, spilling gold over the prairie. The land was vast, empty, and endless, but for the first time, it didn't make her feel small. Jonas squeezed her hand once, firm and sure. She looked up at him, eyes glistening in the dusk. This place, she whispered. It used to scare me. He smiled. It still scares me sometimes. She laughed then, soft and real, the sound fragile but alive. It drifted out over the grass, carried by the wind until it blended with the hum of the land itself. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving offerings behind, flowers, ribbons, folded notes. The porch glowed faintly in the moonlight, the white dress still moving, slow and eternal, like it belonged to the sky now. When everyone was gone, they stayed two figures in the twilight, wrapped in the sound of crickets and the scent of rain far off in the distance. Evelyn leaned her head against Jonas's shoulder. His arm came around her, steady and warm. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say that the wind hadn't already whispered for them. After a while, she lifted her gaze to the stars. Jonas, she murmured, thank you. For what? For seeing me. He turned his head slightly, pressing his cheek against her hair. Always. The night deepened, the fields shimmered silver under the moon, and the house behind them glowed with soft light, not bright, not proud, but alive. The veil lay forgotten in the grass. The sign creaked softly on its nail, and the wind carried away the last of the old stories, the cruel ones, the ones that never knew the truth. What stayed behind wasn't perfect love, or forgiveness dressed in poetry. It was something quieter, a kind of peace that settles only after the heart has stopped running. In the quiet rhythm of Evelyn and Jonas's story lies a truth that time never changes. Beauty fades, but honesty endures. Life will scar us sometimes on the skin, often deeper. Yet what defines us is not what the world sees, but what we dare to show when the masks come off. Jonas did not fall in love with perfection. He fell in love with courage, with the quiet grace of someone who refused to hide forever. For those who have lived long enough to know loss and silence, this story is a gentle reminder it is never too late to be seen for who you truly are. Age, regret, or pain do not take away our worth. They shape the tenderness that others come to cherish. In a world that still praises the surface, the cowboy and the scarred bride teaches us that truth, kindness, and humility are rarer treasures than youth or beauty. Sometimes, the most beautiful thing a person can be is real. So let the years soften you, not harden you. Let your scars tell the story of where you've been, and let your heart, still honest, still brave, be what shines the most. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. If Evelyn and Jonas's journey touched something in your heart, even just a quiet corner, we'd be deeply grateful if you'd leave a like, share this story with someone who still believes in kindness, and subscribe to Wild West Echoes. Every click helps us keep these forgotten tales alive, so we can keep the fire burning, and let the Old West whisper its truths once more, one story at a time.